swallow my pride.
I think for me, it's quite easy to say sorry, but to mean it, that's a different thing. So.
The reality about marriage is we will all hurt our partner in big or small ways, often unintentionally, and sometimes we aren't even aware of what we've done.
But the hurt must be healed if our marriage is to flourish. And in this session, we'll be looking at how that healing can take place.
And anger will usually be our first reaction when we're hurt. While hurt is what we feel in ourselves, anger is what we feel towards the person who's upset us.
Now, we want to make it clear, anger isn't bad in itself. It has a God-given purpose. It's part of our internal mechanism to signal something is wrong and that something needs to be sorted out. The adrenaline rush we feel is designed to spur us into action, but we can use anger wrongly in a number of ways. We want to look at two in particular.
And roughly half the population falls into one category and the other half into the other category. We use two animals to illustrate two inappropriate ways of handling anger. Some people, when they're angry, are inclined to let you know it right away. We call them the rhinos, because a rhino, if it's provoked, is quite likely to put its head down and charge at you. When I was a student, I spent 5 months backpacking across Africa. On one occasion, together with 8 other backpackers, we hired a driver called Joseph to take us in his Land Rover into the nearby game park. 20 minutes after arriving there, Joseph spotted a rhino sitting in the shade of an acacia. We swerved off the road and drove up extremely close so we could take some photos. Joseph reassured us that if the rhino decided to charge at us, he could drive away much faster. Quite quickly, it became apparent that the rhino was not as pleased as we were about us being so close. Sure enough, this massive beast lumbered to its feet, lowered its head, and started to charge at our Land Rover. Joseph duly accelerated away, and true to his word, we easily outpaced the rhino. That is, until a minute or so later, the Land Rover ran out of fuel. We rolled to a halt and turned as one to see the rhino charging at speed in a cloud of dust. Mercifully, it stopped in its tracks, just short of us, and then stood there snorting and shaking its head angrily, clearly trying to get us to move again. We sat frozen in our seats for what seemed like an eternity. Eventually, much to our collective relief, the rhino turned and trotted away about 50 meters, only to turn back and charge at us all over again. Eventually, after 4 hours of these mock charges, it started to get dark. The rhino, by now tired or bored or both, trotted off into the sunset. But once it had gone, Joseph himself trotted off in the opposite direction to get some more fuel, leaving the 9 of us in his Land Rover. We had some great photos, but we were nervous wrecks.
Some people act like the rhino when they're upset. That's me. Let me give you an example. Many years ago, when Nikki and I were living in Japan and Kirsty, our first child, was 4 months old, a bachelor friend of ours who lived 4 hours away in Tokyo invited us to stay with him for the weekend. Well, whenever we had done so in the past, it was always great fun and incredibly busy, as he had amazing energy and was a non-stop entertainer. Well, on the Wednesday, before we were due to go, I suddenly realised I didn't feel I could cope with a weekend like that because of feeding a small baby, being awake half the night, just feeling tired. And I told Nikki I thought we should call our friend and say we couldn't come.
I, on the other hand, was convinced we had to go. I thought it was very rude not to at this late stage, and we had a really heated argument.
And after we had argued backwards and forwards, it became clear to me Nikki really didn't understand how I was feeling, which really upset me. And as a result, I just completely lost it with him.
And I remember the exact spot where Scylla was standing in our apartment, beside the basket where we kept our fruit.
And I was so angry, I picked up the nearest thing, which happened to be an apple from the top of the basket, and I threw it really hard at Nikki. Unfortunately for him, we had just bought a whole box of apples, and they were arranged in a pyramid in the basket, and I proceeded to hurl them one by one across the room at him.
I want to clarify, Scylla was throwing them really hard. I had to duck down behind the sofa to escape being injured until the basket was empty.
Now, I know that sounds very dramatic, and I want to assure you I have never thrown anything else at Nikki, but my tendency even now, when I feel misunderstood or upset, is to attack Nikki with my words.
Other people, like me, respond in the opposite way to the rhino. They may hide or bury their anger, they may become quieter, they may withdraw or become cold when they're angry, and I can certainly identify with the first two of those unhelpful reactions when I'm angry. We call this group the hedgehogs, because a hedgehog, when it's threatened, curls itself up into a ball and sticks out its prickles to keep its attacker at a distance.
Now, it's not that those who act like a hedgehog don't feel their anger, it's just they display it differently, perhaps by withholding affection or by suddenly developing very selective hearing towards their partner.
And while Scylla's danger is explosion, my danger is to hold anger or frustration or hurt inside. And Scylla has no idea how I'm feeling. Hedgehog behaviour is no less harmful in a marriage than rhino behaviour, and I've realised it's better to have things out in the open, to express what I feel when I'm upset.
And I've realised that going on the attack isn't a good way to respond. And I try now to explain more calmly to Nikki what I'm feeling when I'm upset. Rhinos really can learn to calm down and be more sensitive.
It's not just couples with opposite tendencies that have problems. If you have 2 rhinos in a marriage, or 2 hedgehogs, that can be problematic as well. 2 rhinos have to learn to calm down, while 2 hedgehogs have to learn to open up.
So I'm definitely the rhino.
You're not.
For a moment.
So I'm definitely the rhino.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think I've mellowed slightly. That's still my tendency though, is to explode.
I was completely a hedgehog, so everything in me would want to avoid conflict, would want to just kind of to escape from it or just not address it in any kind of way. And I don't think I saw how quickly that made me, but it definitely would make me prickly about little things where. But the funny thing most of the times it would mean that I would stop showing you love in the way that I wanted to be shown love. So I wouldn't hold her hand when I was walking down the street and all that kind of stuff. And in my head I'm like, yeah, she's going to know that I'm not happy with her because I've held that back, which you probably didn't read that in any kind of way. But it was my way of trying to communicate to you that I wasn't happy.
We definitely learned to argue. I think that was one of the really important things for our first few years of marriage, is finding a way to disagree in a way that respects each other and both works with our personality. So we do usually have a little bit of space for me to calm down a little bit so I don't go full rhino, and also for you to process actually what you're thinking, your emotions, so we can come together a bit more calmly.
And we can actually talk and say, this is how I'm feeling, this is what you're thinking, feeling, and what can we do about it.
I want you to turn to the first conversation in your journal called Rhinos and Hedgehogs. Identify if you're more of a rhino or more of a hedgehog. And if you're not sure, ask your partner what they think. They may just have a better idea.
affection, or emotional shutdown. And people who are on the verge of separation often say words to this effect. I don't feel love anymore. In fact, I don't feel anything at all. I feel numb.
This is hardly surprising. It's the physiological response to the unhealed hurt and negative emotions which have accumulated inside. And it means there's no space for the positive feelings of love, romance, affection, and so on.
And unless we deal with the hurt and anger at the root, we end up losing connection, which destroys our intimacy and potentially our whole relationship. The next conversation recognize how you typically when you feel hurt. And we'd like you to take a few minutes to fill in your answers to the questions. Now, you don't need to write too much, be quite instinctive about it, and then discuss what you've heard. Emotional shutdown. And people who are on the verge of separation I don't feel love anymore. In fact, I don't feel anything at all. I feel numb.
This is hardly surprising. It's the physiological response to the unhealed hurt and negative emotions which have accumulated inside. And it means there's no space for positive feelings of love, romance, affection, and so on.
And unless we deal with the hurt and anger at the root, we end up losing connection, which destroys our intimacy and potentially our whole relationship. The next conversation in your journal, called Handling Anger, will help you recognize how you typically respond when you feel hurt. And we'd like you to take a few minutes to fill in your answers to the questions. Now, you don't need to write too much, be quite instinctive about it, and then discuss what you've heard. That we've hurt our partner or have been hurt, we need to take the initiative to bring it out into the open so that things can get healed.
My name is Josiah.
And my name's Heather.
Our families would go to family camp at the same place every summer, and that's kind of when we started dating, and well, the rest is history. I think seeing my dad express wide ranges of emotions, I think because I saw the almost volatile side of that with anger, so never physical anger, but yelling, that kind of thing when he'd get really angry, I think it made me want to shut down because I never wanted to do that. I think I just shut down my external expression of emotion, which then also means that I'm not communicating how I'm feeling. So since we've been married, it's still a journey of being conscious of needing to express how I'm feeling, but if I can bring her into that right away, then it's really helpful for us.
Most of my childhood, I was raised by my dad, and so that was sort of my experiences being raised by men. Being so independent growing up, it was really easy to internalize everything, keep it to myself, and not feel like I could tell anyone how I was truly feeling when I felt hurt. And so a big part of our relationship, even while we were dating, was just learning how to trust the vulnerability, and just be able to say, hey, that really hurt my feelings. And then also understanding that Josiah as a person, he has my best interest at heart, and he's not out to get me or to hurt me. And so I think that's been the big learning curve for us.
When we're both taking the initiative, rather than waiting for the other one to make the first move, things can get sorted out amazingly quickly. However, we recognise that it may not be easy. It could be that we don't like confrontation and we want to keep the peace at all costs. Or perhaps we're afraid of making ourselves vulnerable by opening up to our partner and telling them we're hurt. Or it could be our pride or our shame that stops us admitting we were wrong. Or we're afraid of our partner's reaction.
Any of these reasons can make us reluctant to take the initiative in bringing hurt out into the open. But whether it's big wrongs or small wrongs, when our partner has hurt us by being thoughtless or selfish or cold or unfaithful, the hurt needs to be addressed.
And just as small stones eventually block a drain, so the accumulation of small hurts, if left unaddressed, can break a marriage. We want to give you an example from our own marriage that is relatively trivial on the scale of things. And certainly we've had to address much more serious hurt between us over the years. But we're using this one to show the effect of bringing things out into the open rather than allowing them to stay buried.
Before we tell the story, first, a little bit of background. One of the differences between Cyril and me is that when we go out to see friends and it's time to go home, we have very different ways of leaving. My way is to say thank you and goodbye and then to leave.
And my way is to start saying goodbye and then to begin to have probably my best, most in-depth conversation of the whole evening.
And I've discovered over many years of marriage that if we're to get home when we plan to, we need to start leaving about halfway through the first course of the meal.
And one time, we were at a friend's birthday party. It was in South London, and it was a Thursday evening. It was about a 15-minute drive from our home. And Nicky told me on the way there that the following day was particularly busy for him, so he wanted to get a good night's sleep. So we agreed that we'd make sure we were home by midnight.
Well, knowing what Cyril's like, I decided to double the time it would take us to get home. So I initiated the process of leaving at 11:30 p.m. I said goodbye, and I told Cyril I was just going to get the car that we'd parked at the other end of the road. Well, I drove up to the house and double parked outside in this narrow and crowded London street and waited for Cyril to come out. 20 minutes passed. Midnight came, midnight went. There was no sign of Cyril. So I reparked the car, not an easy maneuver, went back into the house and found Cyril exactly where I'd left her, still deep in conversation. Well, keeping a thick smile on my face so as not to spoil the end of the party, I said to her, I've been waiting in the car, and it's now past midnight. At which point, Scylla looked round at me and said, I didn't even realise you'd left, which rather added insult to injury. So I told her I was going to get the car again, and quite soon, 10 minutes at the most, Scylla joined me. And as we were driving home, she was in great form, chatting away happily about what a fun evening it had been. Meanwhile, I was fuming inside. I was trying to cope not only with my frustration that we were going to get home a lot later than we'd agreed, but also feeling very hurt that Scylla had totally ignored my need for a good night's sleep. As a typical hedgehog, I was trying to work out whether or not to say anything, and I can remember the exact place on the way home when I decided it really wasn't healthy to pretend any longer that everything was okay.
And Nikki suddenly said to me, did you realise I was waiting in the car for you for more than 20 minutes? Well, that really got my attention, and I asked him, are you feeling upset with me? He then told me that he was very cross and rather hurt, that we'd made an agreement which I had totally ignored. Now, when I heard Nikki describe how it felt for him, which he doesn't do all that often, I realised I had been really thoughtless. And so, despite my strong temptation to make excuses, I knew the best thing I could do was to apologise.
And straight away, Scylla said to me, I'm so sorry for making us so late. Please forgive me. Well, as soon as it was out in the open, I didn't find it difficult to forgive, and my feelings of annoyance and hurt evaporated much more quickly than they built up.
So we spent the rest of the journey home discussing how we could communicate more effectively in a crowd about when it's time to leave.
I think I knew the situation would happen again. Indeed, it has happened several times since then. But getting those feelings out into the open, describing to Scylla how I felt, meant there were no negative emotions left inside. The hurt and anger were dealt with.
And most of us hate confrontation, but we need to be able to tell our husband or wife when they've hurt us.
对我来讲，表达感受真的是件很难的事情。我们生气了，我们有冲突了，我们有伤害了。他表达完以后，我告诉他说：“老婆，我很受伤这件事情，我很生气这件事情，对我来讲特别的艰难，因为好像我要打破我以前以往的习惯、以往的信念，因为以往的习惯、以往的信念是男人不能承认自己有脆弱的地方，不能承认自己有需要，不能表现自己的情绪，要冷漠，必须要稳重，必须要一点情绪都没有，这样才说明你是一个刚强的男人，才是一个成熟的男人。所以在夫妻的关系当中，如果我没有表达的时候，我的太太根本不知道我的心里面在想什么，她也进不到我的内心里面去，然后她也不知道这个事情对我们夫妻两人的关系。所以当我去努力去尝试。我很受伤，我很愤怒，我在这个事情上我的感受如何的时候，我们两个人特别容易的能够肩并肩一起来面对问题。
以前是空间上在一起，但是现在是心理的距离，我们可以走近。
So, the first part of the healing process is to talk about the hurt. We need to bring it out into the open. The second part of the process is to say sorry. Apologizing involves taking responsibility for what we've done to hurt our partner. And you'll know how hard it is to admit I was wrong, to say I'm sorry for doing this or saying that. And I know for myself that my pride leads me instinctively to start to make excuses, to jump to my own defense when Scylla tells me I've done something that's upset her.
And I find it easier to swallow my pride and to say sorry when Nikki tells me how what I've done has made him feel. When he uses I statements, it helps me to see it from his perspective.
You just be like, I'm sorry, for whatever you want me to be sorry for. And I would never say sorry, never admit to being wrong.
We always say sorry to each other before we go to bed. If there is an argument, you can't go to bed in our house without saying sorry.
It's harder for me to say sorry than for him. He has taught me how to say sorry by saying sorry first.
I think it's hard to admit when you're wrong. You know, when I have to say sorry, like something tells me, Christina, you're wrong. You have to say sorry. I get convicted pretty much very quickly. I may not act on it for a little bit.
You were brought up, if I say sorry, I'm weak.
He's very good at saying sorry.
And I mean it. You're very good at waiting to say sorry.
It's because you get very angry if I say sorry.
And you don't mean it.
And you say, what are you sorry for? And I can't articulate what I'm sorry for.
会有道歉，但道歉基本上都是在道歉的中间又包含了一种辩解。
就好像我们理性上知道我们有错，我们该道歉，但真的从心底里很难发出那种真诚的一个歉意。
每一次道歉我们都就是要发自心底的道歉。
Taking responsibility and apologising effectively involves finding out from our partner how serious a particular incident was for them. It's discovering where the hurt comes on a kind of Richter scale, where 1 is a light tremor and 10 is catastrophic. So we can ask our partner, is this a 2 or is this a 10 for you? And when we're able to empathise with the extent of their distress, particularly if it's a 9 or a 10, it helps them to feel understood. And that helps hugely with the process of healing. Also, when we say sorry, it's important not to make excuses, such as, I know I was in a bad mood yesterday, but you've no idea of the pressure I'm under at the moment. A true apology doesn't make excuses. When we say, I'm so sorry I hurt you, please forgive me, I'm going to try not to do that again. It's so powerful in a marriage.
As we said, we've had much bigger hurt to deal with than the example we used earlier. And some hurt we've had to talk about had been buried for much longer, including one in particular that went back to before we were married. Well, leaving the party was a 2, maybe a 2.5 on the Richter scale. This one was a 9 or 10 for one of us. And it took some time to explain why it was so painful and then following through with apologising and forgiving. But we were amazed at the difference it made in our marriage. We can still clearly remember those feelings of closeness and freedom it created between us. In a moment, we're going to ask you to do the next conversation in your journals, identifying unresolved hurt. In part 1, each of you think of ways that you've hurt your partner that may still be unresolved for them. Write down whatever comes to mind. Then, in part 2, each of you write down ways that you've been hurt that are still unresolved issues for you. They may be major or minor. They may be recent or from a long way back. Then, when you both finish writing, exchange your journals and follow the instructions.
And for some of you, there may only be one issue, or maybe nothing comes to mind. And for you, this session will help you to see how to keep the drain clear in the future. Others of you will have many issues. You're dealing with a backlog, and this may be a process that takes some time. You may not be able to express why you feel hurt all in one go. But we hope that for you, this session will be the start of clearing out days, weeks, months, or even years of unhealed hurt and buried anger.
For some couples, this conversation is the hardest part of the marriage course, and things can get worse before they get better. But please, don't be put off, because the result of clearing the drain, if it is blocked, is amazing. It can bring you new levels of closeness, as it did for us. I'm going to say a short prayer before you start, asking for God's help, and do please close your eyes if you'd like to. Lord, thank you that you give us your Spirit to help us. We We ask you to guide each person to know what to write down and to talk about in this conversation. We pray that each couple would go at the right speed. And for those who have many issues to deal with, we ask that this would be the beginning of a process that will lead to the drain being cleared. Please help every couple to be gentle with each other as they do this. Amen.
Completely different. The resentment and self-pity left, and our relationship was restored. And we went on to have a great rest of the weekend together because my choosing to forgive had opened the way for us to draw close again.
Sometimes people have said to us, but I just can't forgive him or her for that. You don't understand. When we say, I can't forgive, what we're really saying is either I won't forgive, or perhaps I don't know how to forgive. And often that's because we're waiting for something to happen before we can forgive. We may be waiting for the right feelings, or we're waiting for justice to be done, or we're wanting revenge first, or we're wanting to retaliate, wanting the other person to be punished. Then we think we'll be able to forgive. Forgiveness means choosing to let go of those desires, however strong they may be. The author C.S. Lewis wrote, forgiveness goes beyond human fairness. It's pardoning those things that can't readily be pardoned at all. If we don't forgive, if we don't release the other person, we'll be the one imprisoned by the negative emotions, by the bitterness, the resentment, the desire for revenge, and the anger that builds up inside us. Only forgiveness can set us free.
So my name's Mark.
I'm Laura. Just fell in love with Mark quite quickly. I just saw that this was a man that was loyal, trustworthy, and someone that I thought I could be with forever.
Forgiveness is a really important part of our marriage and part of our story because we'd both hurt each other so many times. They weren't the kind of thing where you could go, well, it doesn't really matter, hasn't really affected me.
My priorities were all completely wrong. I wasn't carving out the time that was needed for our marriage. I was married, but it was kind of more like flatmates over time with Mark, like working a lot. I decided that marriage and Mark wasn't what I wanted anymore. So we separated. And we were separated for 8 months.
I guess in my way I was trying to fight for our relationship, but there were just so many things that we hadn't worked out. And Laura was gradually drifting further and further away.
You know, God did something really wonderful in my heart and, sorry. And that day I rang up Mark and I said, yeah, I'm 100% in. I want to do this.
And I thought if God can forgive me for all the stuff that I'm aware of that I feel really ashamed about, then maybe he can help me extend that forgiveness to Laura. Over time, I was able to not just say I forgive you, but actually live that out. There's still memories. I can still remember them. I can still remember how it felt, but it doesn't have that power.
I walked away from my marriage. I hurt you so badly, but that's the amazing thing about forgiveness is that, you know, real beauty has come out from this pain, and forgiveness is a massive part of what we've moved through.
From a Christian viewpoint, forgiveness means releasing the person who's hurt us into God's hands, even if the other person doesn't apologize or recognize what they've done wrong. The Christian understanding of forgiveness is that God forgives us freely, and therefore we must forgive each other freely. And I find it helpful to think of forgiveness flowing into my life from God and then flowing out of my life to those around. Especially the person closest to Nikki. Whether you've got a Christian faith or not, we can all choose to forgive. Where there's forgiveness right at the heart of a marriage, it has unparalleled power to bring healing.
I want to talk about what happens when we use this process to heal the ways we hurt each other and break out of that downward spiral. St. Paul uses this phrase in the Bible, love keeps no record of wrongs. Imagine for a moment having a notebook that represents our married life. Each page of the notebook represents one day of our marriage. Every day we write down a list of the things we do or say or fail to do or say that are less than perfectly loving, that may hurt our husband or wife, sometimes slightly and sometimes deeply. On some days, the list will be shorter, and on other days, the list will be longer, and it may even go over the page occasionally. But every day, there'll be something we could put on the page. And if these things are not dealt with, the page will be turned and the list left intact. We then start to build up a backlog of resentment and bitterness. And even if we can't remember the details of the list, these things remain in the background of our marriage and will seriously spoil our intimacy. Forgiveness means tearing off each page with whatever's written on it and throwing it away. That means choosing to forgive however we feel, not letting the sun go down on our anger, keeping the drain clear, and keeping no record of wrongs until there's a clean page in front and none turned over behind. Then we can begin each day with a fresh start and no backlog between us. When we've been through this process of talking about our hurt, saying sorry and forgiving, we can start again together.
However, don't expect healing always to be instant. Apology and forgiveness remove the distance between us, but where there's deep hurt, it takes time for trust to be rebuilt, and forgiveness needs to be an ongoing process. That sometimes means choosing to forgive on a daily basis, each time the pain resurfaces.
And while rebuilding trust, we need to be gentle with each other and have an understanding of the bruising that's taken place. Being kind in the way we behave towards each other, going on forgiving, setting aside date nights, and comforting each other are all part of the process.
And this comforting may well be needed both ways, both towards a partner who may well feel a deep sense of shame for what they've done, as well as towards the one who's been hurt. This week, we'd encourage you to spend some time thinking about the hurt that your partner's told you about. The continuing conversations involve carrying on with the healing process of apologizing and forgiving each other and rebuilding trust between you.
We suggest that for these last few moments, whatever you talked about this session, you ask your partner, what could I do to help you with this process of healing? Listen, and then if you're comfortable praying, say a prayer for each other, either aloud or silently. Otherwise, express comfort to your partner for what they've told you in some other way.